This is Faith Ignited, the podcast where we put God back into history. Episode 21, In Virtue's Cause. Ben wiped his hands on his dirty trousers as he stared up at the rows of buildings and streets stretching out in front of him. So this was Philadelphia. It was a sight to behold. With some relief, Ben stepped off the ship that had carried him down the Atlantic, his feet touching solid ground for the first time in days. The smells associated with the docks weren't all pleasant, but the salty fragrance of the sea represented one thing to him: freedom. He would have been a sailor if his father hadn't strongly objected to it. Ben sighed, squaring his shoulders. Farewell, Boston, he thought to himself. Hello, sweet independence. No more indentured apprenticeships. No more being subject to his older brother. No more beatings. Ben might have been just 17 years old and a runaway, but he was a skilled printer in his own right, and had to believe that whatever he was running toward was better than what he'd left behind. His arms still ached from the rowing that he'd done on the last leg of the journey. But even as exhausted and starved as he was, there was a strange sort of thrill that filled him at the prospect of starting over in this new place. Now he just needed to find work, and of course, a place to stay. A bit of a daunting task in a city where he didn't know a soul. As he began striding down the unfamiliar streets, he spotted a bakery, and feeling the pangs from his stomach, he stopped. He only had a Dutch dollar and a shilling of copper, but he purchased 3 great puffy rolls to curb his terrible hunger. He walked off with one roll under each arm as he ate the other. As he strode down Market Street, he spotted a young woman standing in the doorway of one of the homes. She was watching him with curiosity, and he suddenly felt rather self-conscious of his, no doubt, awkward and ridiculous appearance. He was still in his work clothes, his best clothes still to come from the sea, and his pockets stuffed with shirts and stockings. What a sight he must have been! But as his feet strode forward, he tried to keep his chin up. If hard work was the price to pay, he would make his way in this city. In Shakespeare's tragedy Othello, we learn the sad tale of a Moorish general who is persuaded by his bitter ensign Iago to believe that his wife is being unfaithful with his lieutenant Cassio. Though it's not true, the general is driven to madness and does terrible things in response to his jealousy. Like many of Shakespeare's works, this story deals with some dark themes, but it teaches one lesson very well. There is great danger in believing a lie. At one point after hearing this unfounded story of infidelity that he's falsely involved in, Cassio cries out, "Reputation, reputation, reputation. Oh, I have lost my reputation. I have lost the immortal part of myself, and what remains is bestial." Cassio agonizes to think how others now see him, especially when he hasn't done anything to deserve their scorn. Whether or not it's a lie, the damage is done, because in the minds of the public, it's the truth. Now, the figure I'm going to introduce to you in this episode, were he alive today, might be inclined to utter the same line Cassio did in Othello. His reputation in many ways has been dragged through the mud, and he too has been accused of infidelity. And just as upsetting, he's been held up as an example of secularism and proof that many of the founders were deists or atheists. And quite frankly, it disgusts me when I see some of these accusations passed off as facts, even in some of our school textbooks. So it's time for us to separate fact from fiction, and distinguish the rumors from the supported facts. It's time for the real Benjamin Franklin to stand up and introduce himself. I hope by the end of this episode, you'll come to see him for the man he really was, not some bestial slave to his passions, who cared nothing for religion or God, but a man of incredible intelligence, character, virtue, and faith. Born into a home in Boston, Massachusetts in the year 1706, and despite the fact that Boston was iced over in the wintry cold, the infant was bundled in a blanket and the same day carried to the Old South Church for his baptism. Franklin was the 15th of 17 children to enter his family between his father's 2 marriages. His father, Josiah Franklin, had descended from the Church of England as a young man and had emigrated to America at age 25, seeking religious freedom in the New World. Franklin described his father as a very wise man, but along with his father's sound judgment, he had a mechanical genius, an attribute that was passed down to his son, as the following story illustrates. Franklin wrote, "I amused myself one day with flying a paper kite, and approaching the bank of a pond, which was near a mile broad, I tied the string to a stake, and the kite ascended to a very considerable height above the pond while I was swimming. In a little time, being desirous of amusing myself with my kite, and enjoying at the same time the pleasure of swimming, I returned, and loosing from the stake the string with the little stick which was fastened to it, went again into the water, where I found that lying on my back and holding the stick in my hands, I was drawn along the surface of the water in a very agreeable manner. Having then engaged another boy to carry my clothes around the pond to a place which I pointed out to him on the other side, I began to cross the pond with my kite, which carried me quite over without the least fatigue and with the greatest pleasure imaginable." Franklin's inquisitive mind and insatiable thirst for knowledge found satisfaction in books. He wrote, "I do not remember when I could not read, and that all the little money that came into my hands was ever laid out in books. Often I sat up in my room reading the greatest part of the night." Impressed by his desire to learn, Franklin's father placed him in the Boston Grammar School when he was 8 years old, quote, "intending to devote me as the tithe of his sons to the service of the church." But the expense of education proved too much for Franklin's family. So after the first year, he was withdrawn from school and studied with a private tutor for another year before having to quit his formal education altogether so he could help his father with the family business. So in total, he had only 2 years of formal schooling. Who would have thought that he would rise to become one of the most brilliant and accomplished minds of his time? But Franklin had no interest in the family business, which was making candles and soap. What he really wanted to do was become a sailor. But his father, who had already lost an older son to the sea, was not eager to see Franklin follow the same path. Instead, he apprenticed him under his older half-brother in the printing business. Franklin writes, "In 1717, my brother James returned from England with a press and letters to set up his business in Boston. I liked it much better than that of my father, but still had a hankering for the sea. To prevent the apprehended effect of such an inclination, my father was impatient to have me bound to my brother. I stood out some time, but at last was persuaded and signed the indentures when I was yet but 12 years old. I was to serve as an apprentice until I was 21 years of age. In a little time I made great proficiency in the business, and became a useful hand to my brother." During his time as an apprentice, with much more access to books, Franklin's mind and writing abilities expanded greatly. As an older man, he reflected, "Prose writing has been of great use to me in the course of my life, and was a principal means of my advancement." By the time he was 16, Franklin wanted to get his own writing in the newspapers, but he knew that his brother was unlikely to print anything that came from him. So he, quote, "contrived to disguise my hand and writing an anonymous paper. I put it at night under the door of the printing house." So he wrote under a fake alias, a fictional widow that he created called Silence Dogood. Under this false identity, he shared humorous and sometimes profound insights. These letters became wildly popular, and a source of debate over who might be this mysterious person behind the letters. Everyone thought that it must have been written by someone of considerable skill and education. No one suspected the young apprentice. These letters are an extraordinary testament not just of Franklin's humor and wit, but his deep and insightful nature. One of those letters contained this profound insight. Without freedom of thought, there can be no such thing as wisdom, and no such thing as public liberty without freedom of speech, which is the right of every man as far as by it he does not hurt or control the right of another. And this is the only check it ought to suffer, and the only bounds it ought to know. This sacred privilege is so essential to free governments that the security of property and the freedom of speech always go together, and in those wretched countries where a man cannot call his tongue his own, he can scarce call anything else his own. Whoever would therefore overthrow the liberty of a nation must begin by subduing its free speech. Here Benjamin Franklin, as a 16-year-old boy, is articulating ideas that wouldn't be written in the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights for another half a century. That is so extraordinary. But once Franklin grew tired of writing under his pseudonym, he let his brother in on the little secret, and it did not go over well. No doubt due to some jealousy and resentment on the part of James. Franklin wrote, "My brother was passionate and had often beaten me, which I took extremely amiss. And thinking my apprenticeship very tedious, I was continually wishing for some opportunity of shortening it." And he added in a marginal note in his autobiography, "I fancy his harsh and tyrannical treatment of me might have been the means of impressing me with that aversion to arbitrary power that has stuck to me throughout my whole life." So at age 17, Franklin decides to take matters into his own hands and runs away. This is how he ended up coming to Philadelphia. Though he came with practically nothing, the young Franklin was able to secure work at a print shop, and his employer helped him to find housing with a man named John Reed, whose daughter Deborah had watched him from their doorway that first day on Market Street. Little did he know that she was to be his future wife. Philadelphia proved a place of great opportunity for Franklin, but he still had much to discover about his own identity and beliefs. Ben stared at the endless expanse of ocean stretching out in front of the ship, thinking how very isolating sea travel could be. He'd not been terribly impressed with his fellow passengers, who he'd found to be not the most interesting conversationalists. And they, like him, had grown sullen, silent, and reserved over the past months of their journey. It was understandable that they'd all become somewhat irritable during their long voyage, being tossed about on the never-ending waters. Weeks ago, they'd seen another ship, which had been a strangely thrilling sight to behold. At times, it felt like they were Noah and his company in the Ark, the only surviving remnant of the human race, and seeing other human faces reminded them that they weren't alone in the world. Ben sighed, his mind flitting back on the year and a half that he'd spent in London after leaving Philadelphia. It hadn't turned out exactly as he'd imagined, actually not at all as he'd imagined. When Philadelphia Governor Sir William Keith had approached Ben at the print shop where he worked in Philadelphia, he was surprised to say the least. He well recalled the look on the man's face as he sat across from him at one of the nearby taverns. The governor had laid all sorts of promises at Ben's feet. A business of his own, government printing contracts, a passage to England with letters of credit and introduction to establish ties with all of the English booksellers and stationaries. It had all sounded so grand. Ben laughed ruefully now as he thought on all those undelivered promises. Then he cringed a little as he thought of his own unkept promises. In the entire time he'd been in London, he'd written to Miss Deborah Reed only once, and that was simply to say he wasn't going to be coming back anytime soon. It seems her mother had been right to doubt the seriousness of his intentions. Perhaps he had gotten a little carried away with London life, despite those confounded letters of recommendation never reaching him before his passage back to the old world. Ben had done quite well fending for himself in England. He'd gotten work at a prosperous London print shop, and though he'd spent a good deal of his time working and reading, he'd also spent a good share of his money on plays and amusements. He'd even taught some of his fellow employees how to swim, a callback to his youth, and perhaps one of the reasons he'd earned the nickname the Water American. But the main reason was because he drank water rather than beer that the other workers guzzled throughout the day. But after seeing Ben carry twice as much as they could, they admitted that the strong drink wasn't actually making them stronger. But Ben had grown weary of London life. He wanted to go home, and the clerk position Mr. Denham had offered seemed like the perfect opportunity to say farewell to England. The journey had given him some valuable time for introspection. While in London, he'd written and published a pamphlet on the doctrine of fate. The work had been a reflection of Ben's own free-thinking ideas, but he still often thought about the purpose of life and the nature of God. He was turning over a new leaf coming back to the colonies, and he had resolved to be frugal, industrious, truthful, and to not speak ill of other people, virtues that he felt would help guarantee his success in life. Just then, Ben heard a call out above him. He turned his head to hear the words more clearly, and his heart leapt with joy when the words registered. Land had been spotted. Overcome with anticipation, he rushed to the other side of the deck, squinting to try and witness it for himself. It was barely a speck on the horizon, blurred by two small tears gathering in his eyes. But it was a glorious sight all the same. Philadelphia. I've stated this principle in previous episodes, but I'm going to re-emphasize it again because it's critical for understanding history correctly. People change. Can I say that again? People change. And context matters. Life was designed to beat imperfections out of us, so it's erroneous to categorize someone based on their past. But that's exactly what people do with Benjamin Franklin. Looking back at the earlier part of his life, he openly acknowledged, quote, "that hard-to-be-governed passion of youth had hurried me frequently into intrigues with low women that fell in my way. But I hasten to add that he expressed gratitude that, quote, the kind hand of Providence, or some guardian angel, or accidental favorable circumstances and situations, or altogether, preserved me, without any willful gross immorality or injustice that might have been expected from my want of religion." Franklin explains that his want of religion came about in his early teens while he was living in Boston. He wrote, "My parents had early given me religious impressions and brought me through my childhood piously in the dissenting way," meaning that they were Protestants. "But I was scarce 15, when after doubting by turns of several points as I found them disputed in the different books I read, I began to doubt of revelation itself. Some books against deism fell into my hands, but it happened that they wrought an effect on me quite contrary to what was intended by them, for the arguments of the deists, which were quoted to be refuted, appeared to me much stronger than the refutations. In short, I soon became a thorough deist." Now this is where modern historians love to stop. They say, see, he wrote himself that he was a deist. But let's read a little further, shall we? He writes, "My arguments perverted some others, but each of them having afterwards wronged me greatly without the least compunction, and recollecting Keith's conduct toward me, who was another freethinker, and my own towards Miss Reed, which at times gave me great trouble, I began to suspect that this doctrine of deism, though it might be true, was not very useful." What Benjamin Franklin basically just said in that paragraph was a rephrasing of the idea that Christ taught when he said that by their fruits ye shall know them. He was starting to see that the fruits of deism were not good. They were not making him or others who adopted that philosophy into better people. Now, if you're wondering, a deist is someone who believes in the existence of God or a higher power, but their beliefs are based on reason and observation, not revelation. They view God almost like a clockmaker, who sets the clock running and then steps away, unconcerned about its outcome. So, no miracles, no revelation. And something you'll learn as we go on that's critical to comprehending Benjamin Franklin is that he was always focusing on bettering his own nature. So recognizing that deism was not doing that for him, he started to question his own way of thinking. Shortly after arriving back in Philadelphia and taking his position as a clerk, Franklin had what must have been a pretty impactful experience. He writes, "Mr. Denham took a store in Water Street, where we opened our goods. I attended the business diligently, studied accounts, and grew in a little time expert at selling. We lodged and boarded together. He counseled me as a father, having a sincere regard for me. I respected and loved him, and we might have gone on together very happily, but in the beginning of February 1727, when I had just passed my 21st year, we both were taken ill. My distemper was a pleurisy, which very nearly carried me off. I suffered a good deal, gave up the point in my own mind, and was rather disappointed when I found myself recovering, regretting in some degrees that I must now have all that disagreeable work to do over again. I forget what his distemper was. It held him a long time, and at length carried him off. The store was taken into the care of his executors, and my employment under him ended." So this is the reason that Franklin ends up getting back in the printing business. But I can't help but think that this must have been somewhat of a turning point. Losing a close friend to death is sure to bring up some questions about God and the afterlife. This idea makes even more sense when you learn that the very next year, in 1728, Franklin wrote what he called his Articles of Belief and Acts of Religion, which would be his personal creed and guideline for his private worship the rest of his life. In the opening of his first principles, he writes, "I conceive that he, God, has in himself some of those passions he has planted in us, and that since he has given us reason whereby we are capable of observing his wisdom in the creation, he is not above caring for us, being pleased with our praise and offended when we slight or neglect his glory. I conceive, for many reasons, that he is a good being, and as I should be happy to have so wise, good, and powerful a being my friend, let me consider in what manner I shall make myself most acceptable to him. Next to the praise resulting from and due to his wisdom, I believe he is pleased and delights in the happiness of those he has created. And since without virtue man can have no happiness in this world, I firmly believe he delights to see me virtuous, because he is pleased when he sees me happy. I love him therefore for his goodness, and I adore him for his wisdom. Let me then not fail to praise my God continually, for it is his due, and it is all I can return for his many favors and great goodness to me. And let me resolve to be virtuous, that I may be happy, that I may please him who is delighted to see me happy. Amen." He then goes on to give prayers of praise and thanks to the Creator, and another prayer asking God to help him eschew or avoid evil and embrace virtue. What a glorious glimpse into the heart of this great man. The initial time back in Philadelphia was a transformative one for Franklin. He was seeking to change and make restitution in more ways than one. Deborah Reed, after having received Franklin's one letter from London, gave into the urging of her friends to marry a potter named John Rogers, a man who proved to be entirely dishonorable. She ended up leaving him after discovering that he already had another wife. Rogers then spent her entire dowry, fell into deep debt, and fled to the West Indies, where he was reported to have died. Franklin called his neglect of that relationship, quote, "one of the greatest errata of my life, which I should wish to correct if I should live again." Not long after news had reached Philadelphia that Deborah's first husband was dead, Franklin renewed their romance. He wrote, "I pitied poor Miss Reed's unfortunate situation, who was generally dejected, seldom cheerful, and avoided company. I considered my giddiness and inconstancy when in London as in a great degree the cause of her unhappiness, though the mother was good enough to think the fault more her own than mine, as she had prevented our marrying before I went thither, and persuaded the other match in my absence. Deborah Reed and Benjamin Franklin were married in 1731, and Deborah proved to be a good and faithful helpmate. Franklin says, "We throve together and have ever mutually endeavored to make each other happy. Thus I corrected that great erratum as well as I could." It's apparent from Franklin's writings that he felt much more content about his life after his marriage to Deborah. He frequently referred to marriage as the happiest of all conditions. He later wrote, "Marriage is the most natural state of man, and therefore the state in which you are most likely to find solid happiness. It is the man and woman united that make the complete human being. Separate, she wants his force of body and strength of reason, he her softness, sensibility, and acute discernment. Together they are more likely to succeed in the world. A single man has not nearly the value he would have in the state of union. He is an incomplete animal. He resembles the odd half of a pair of scissors." The Franklins had 3 children, and by hard work and frugality, they quickly paid off all of their debts, owning their printing business free and clear just 2 years after they were married. Franklin was distinguished by his work ethic. If you passed by his shop in the morning, you'd likely find him already working, and probably still there when you went home for the night. He was ever endeavoring to improve himself, both intellectually and morally as well. Ben shifted on the uncomfortable wooden bench, again trying to fix his mind on the words of the Presbyterian minister, who had been droning on for the past quarter of an hour. The man had often visited Ben, prevailing upon him to attend Sunday worship services, but this experience reminded him why he often maintained his religious observances in private. The sermon was dry, uninteresting, and unedifying. There wasn't a single moral principle being emphasized. The minister seemed far more determined to make Presbyterians of the congregation than good citizens, and it quite disgusted Ben. Sundays were his study day, and the day that he focused on his own religious principles. He'd resolved some time ago to improve himself in every area. Mentally, of course. Reading was the only recreation he allowed himself, and through his books he taught himself French, Italian, Spanish, Latin, and German. He'd also learned to play the harp, the violin, and the guitar. But a greater goal had consumed his mind as of late, what he termed the goal of moral perfection. After all, if he had a firm understanding of what was right and wrong, why might he not always choose the right thing? He had decided on 13 specific virtues on which he planned to focus, namely temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, and humility. Humility had been a suggestion of a friend of his, but in total, his desire was to imitate 2 persons, Jesus and Socrates. For some time, he'd been marking down his progress in a little book that he used to examine himself. He had decided to take on one virtue at a time, focusing on a different one each week, so in 13 weeks total, he'd have gone through all of them. And eventually, he hoped to arrive at that goal of perfection. As Ben rose and left the church, he resolved to not return. He had for some years spent his Sabbaths going over his own articles of belief and acts of religion, and he felt that he gained much more from that practice than the public assemblies. Many historians see the fact that Benjamin Franklin rarely attended church, or favored any particular Christian sect, as evidence that he was not a religious man. That couldn't be farther from the truth. Benjamin Franklin was a deeply religious man. He just found something lacking in the churches that he encountered. In fact, he wrote, "Whosoever shall introduce into public affairs the principles of primitive Christianity will change the face of the world." He summarized his feelings on the subject in this way. "I had been religiously educated as a Presbyterian, and though some of the dogmas of that persuasion appeared to me unintelligible, others doubtful, and I early absented myself from the public assemblies of the sect, Sunday being my studying day, I never was without some religious principles. I never doubted, for instance, the existence of the deity, that he made the world and governed it by his providence, that the most acceptable service of God was doing good to man, that our souls are immortal, and that all crime will be punished and virtue rewarded, either here or hereafter. Probably one of the most vulnerable confessions of his feelings on faith comes from a letter he wrote to Ezra Stiles, the president of Yale College. He wrote, "As to Jesus of Nazareth, my opinion of whom you particularly desire, I think the system of morals and his religion, as he left them to us, the best the world ever saw, or is likely to see. But I apprehend it has received various corrupting changes, and I have, with most of the present dissenters in England, some doubts as to his divinity, though it is a question I do not dogmatize upon, having never studied it, and think it needless to busy myself with it now, when I expect soon an opportunity of knowing the truth with less trouble." And then he wraps up his thoughts at the end, saying, "I shall only add, respecting myself, that having experienced the goodness of that being in conducting me prosperously through a long life, I have no doubt of its continuance in the next, though without the smallest conceit of meriting such goodness." Benjamin Franklin's faith is a little more complicated. He did have questions about Jesus Christ, but that didn't keep him from donating generously to building churches. Most importantly, it did not keep him from patterning his life after the Master. It was with Jesus and Socrates in mind that Franklin created his 13 virtues. He wrote, "I wished to live without committing any fault at any time. I would conquer all that either natural inclination, custom, or company might lead me into. As I knew or thought I knew what was right and wrong, I did not see why I might not always do the one and avoid the other." But as he reflected back on a lifetime pursuit of acquiring virtue, he wrote, "Though I never arrived at the perfection I had been so ambitious of obtaining, but fell far short of it, yet I was by the endeavor a better and happier man than I otherwise should have been. And it may be well my posterity should be informed that to this little artifice, with the blessing of God, their ancestor owed the constant felicity of his own life down to his 79th year, in the which this is written. I hope, therefore, that some of my descendants may follow the example and reap the benefits." But along with his inward pursuits, Franklin sought the benefit of his country. Now, in this episode, we can't get into all of his temporal accomplishments. I'm going to struggle to even summarize them, and I really wanted to focus more on his faith and character. But just to give you an idea, he founded the American Philosophical Society. He also created Philadelphia's first public hospital, fire department, insurance company, and also helped found the University of Pennsylvania. He was internationally renowned for his scientific achievements, specifically in the area of electricity. His inventions and discoveries made him one of the leading scientists of his day, and earned him a number of honorary degrees. He was also an exceptionally successful publisher and printer, and created a lot of phrases that we still use today, including "early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. A penny saved is a penny earned. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure," and so on. All of these, by the way, are ideas that Franklin embodied himself. He was as industrious and hard-working a man as you'd probably ever come across. After he retired from the printing trade, he'd hoped to spend some time on his own pursuits, but, quote, "The public, now considering me a man of leisure, laid hold of me for their purposes, every part of our civil government, and almost at the same time, imposing some duty on me." He was elected 10 years in a row as a member of the Philadelphia Assembly, despite never asking for votes or voicing any desire to be chosen. But as would be the pattern of his life, Franklin stepped up to the calls he was given. The June humidity hung thick in the Pennsylvania State House, nearly as choking as the tension in the air. George Washington, as the one presiding over the convention as president, sat in the most prominent chair in the front. The poor man seemed to have aged a great deal since taking his command at the beginning of the Revolution. The chair on which Washington sat had the carving of a sun. Whether rising or setting, it was hard to tell. It seemed symbolic in a way. Many wondered about the destiny of this newly freed nation. Was their independence the rising or setting of freedom? Much would be determined by what took place in this very room. Ben had personally signed the Treaty of Paris, officially ending the war for independence, after nearly 7 years in France trying to garner their aid for the American cause, which had proved absolutely indispensable. His duties in Europe had often pulled him away from his family, something that had been a great trial for him. His oldest son William had gone with him on one of his trips overseas, but Deborah never had. She was deathly afraid of sea travel, and he never was able to convince her. He'd had to settle with their frequent correspondence, but that hardly alleviated the ache of missing her. Ben well remembered when he was in England and received the news that his dear wife Deborah had died. The news had been utterly heartrending. That had been over 13 years ago, but he still devoted himself to the American cause. This time not abroad, but on American soil. Ben sat next to James Wilson, the other delegate from Pennsylvania. Likewise, all of the men sat with their fellow state representatives, and the arrangement was appropriate, considering the divisions originating around the different states. While it was clear to them all that the Articles of Confederation they'd been operating under thus far were insufficient for the future, what should replace it still had yet to be decided upon. All attempts to come together resulted in heated disagreements. Ben had frequently called upon the peacemaking skills he'd gained in the nearly 18 years he'd spent as a diplomat to try and calm the heated exchanges. He was the oldest by far of the delegates present, their ages ranging from Jonathan Dayton at just 26 years old to Ben himself at 81, but their ages were hardly the only thing dividing them. Their varying opinions, as well as their self-interests for their own states, had broken apart all attempts so far at forming a new government. Rhode Island had refused to even be a part of the deliberations. After listening to the contention for some time, Ben could finally stand it no more. Limbs aching with age, he rose to his feet, calling the room to silence. Addressing George Washington specifically, but the room as a whole, he said, "In this situation, in this assembly, groping as it were in the dark to find political truth, and scarce able to distinguish it when presented to us, how has it happened, sir, that we have not hitherto once thought of humbly applying to the Father of Lights to illuminate our understandings?" He glanced around at the faces of the delegates, continuing, "In the beginning of this contest with Great Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayers in this room for the divine protection. Our prayers, sir, were heard and they were graciously answered. I therefore beg leave to move that henceforth prayers imploring the assistance of heaven and its blessings on our deliberations be held in this assembly every morning before we proceed to business, and that one or more of the clergy of this city be requested to officiate in that service." Ben looked back at Washington, whose expression was neutral, but Ben knew he too was a man with a firm belief in Providence. Ben continued, "I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We have been assured, sir, in the sacred writings, that except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. I firmly believe this, and I also believe that without his concurring aid, we shall succeed this political building no better than the builders of Babel. We shall be divided by our little partial local interests, our projects will be confounded, and we ourselves shall become a reproach and a byword down to the future ages." As Franklin wrapped up his passionate speech and sat back down in his chair, the feeling in the room seemed to have altered some, and Ben just hoped that with God's assistance, they might form a constitution and a government that would withstand the test of time. Surely one of the greatest evidences of Benjamin Franklin's faith that showed just how far he'd come from that teenage boy who'd proclaimed himself a thorough deist is the speech he delivered during the Constitutional Convention in 1787. The more you study Benjamin Franklin through his own words, rather than what other people say about him, the more it becomes obvious what a faith-filled man he really was. It's in this light of understanding his faith and character that we need to view the allegations alleged against him regarding his infidelity. There are all sorts of spurious claims of his immorality, specifically his behavior when away from his family on diplomatic trips. This, of course, ignoring the tender letters that were sent back and forth across the ocean between Franklin and Deborah, and his constant desire that she join him. She refused because of her intense fear of sea travel, but it's obvious that they had a close and loving relationship, and Franklin was devastated by her death. But as far as his morality goes, I think the issue is best addressed by a paragraph from The Real Benjamin Franklin by Andrew M. Allison. Quote, Carl Van Doren, whose masterful biography of Franklin was awarded the Pulitzer Prize, noted that there is no support for the tradition which insists that the philosopher was a lively lecher in France. Another historian has asked, did he really have affairs with French women? There is no shred of evidence. In that age of diaries and memoirs, not a single Parisian ever boasted that she had captured the famous philosopher. And a third scholar places this whole matter in perspective. In any sophisticated social gathering at which the name of Benjamin Franklin comes up, somebody is almost sure to remark with a leer, "Say, that old boy was quite a man with the ladies," or "Wasn't he that old reprobate?" This concept of the worthy doctor seems to have started many years after his death, and to have grown during recent years. There is no reference to it in early writings about him, except for scurrilous political slander regarding his son William's legitimacy. There is not one iota of evidence in history to justify this image. True, Franklin liked women, and many women adored Franklin. He was closely associated with several, ranging from 11-year-old Catherine Shipley in England to 60-ish Madame Helvetius in France. He spent much time in their company, and some of his most interesting writing is in correspondence with female friends. But there is nothing to indicate that his relations with any of them were anything other than gallant and intellectual. And Thomas Jefferson said this of Benjamin Franklin, "I have seen with extreme indignation the blasphemies lately vented against the memory of the father of American philosophy. But his memory will be preserved and venerated as long as the thunder of heaven shall be heard or feared." We began this episode with a reference to Shakespeare, and it seems only appropriate that we end it in the same fashion. In yet another of his works, Shakespeare penned these stirring words, "He lives in fame that died in virtue's cause." I don't know that there's hardly anyone more deserving of that description than Benjamin Franklin, who spent his entire life seeking to better the world and himself. The University of Chicago did a study in 2020 that showed only 14% of Americans describing themselves as very happy, marking the lowest level in about 5 decades. Now, you might say that has something to do with COVID, but this is not the only study that has indicated a drop in happiness among Americans in general. Now, the study lists a number of possible reasons why this might be the case, such as isolation and an increase in mental illnesses, which are certainly factors, but I believe that they're totally missing the heart of the issue. I'll summarize it this way. It is our decline in virtue that has resulted in our decline in happiness. We are seeing faith and family values plummeting at a disturbing rate, with society racing toward a selfish and godless future. If we could but learn this one lesson that Benjamin Franklin understood so well, God delights to see us virtuous because he delights to see us happy. It is a law of heaven that happiness and goodness go hand in hand. God is the source of happiness. It is impossible to find lasting joy apart from Him. Ultimately, the other things we pursue will leave us empty and miserable. What we need today as a nation and as a world is a return to virtue, a return to holiness. It is those values that make us great, and those values that will ignite our faith. If you felt impacted by this episode, please like, share, and subscribe so that the fire of faith can continue to spread.